Hello everyone, Mr. B here. So we are now in Unit 4. We did Chapter 10, which I apologize, it was all in one video, but as you saw, only 20 minutes. But this chapter has a little bit more to it. It has to do with personality, which is a lot of fun. So it's going to be split into 3 different videos, but hopefully each one should be a little bit shorter than the Chapter 10. But as we will look in, you will see that for each video, since it is being split up, there is 7 different things that you will need to know from this video that will be on the next exam. So let's get right into it. Alright, and as I mentioned, this chapter is all about personality. So what do we mean by personality? What makes our personality, what determines, I guess I should say, our personality. But the very first thing, which you will need to know for the exam, is how we define personality. And so it is a relatively stable constellation of psychological characteristics and behavioral patterns that account for our individual and consistency over time. That's a mouthful. The thing to take away from this is that our personality is relatively stable, and it's looking at characteristics and behavioral patterns. So if you're, relatively speaking, a nice person, or you're mean, you're silly, stuff like that, that makes up your personality. And the reason why it says relatively stable is if your personality is completely stable and never changes, that could be a sign of a personality disorder. On the whole other side of the spectrum, if your personality is all over the place, it's like, you're a different person every single day, that could also be a sign of a personality disorder. The reason why we say relatively stable is, you could be a generally nice person, but if someone, screws you over too many times, or, you're having a really bad day, you might not be the kindest person that day. So it's relatively stable. That's a thing to take away from this definition. And so what we're going to be going over today in this video is we are going to be looking at the psychodynamic perspective. So this has to do, for some of it, with Freud, who kind of founded the psychodynamic perspective. We're going to get into a bit of a mature topic with Freud, and then we're going to talk about some neo-Freudian views as well for personality. And as you know from previous chapters, when we talk about Freud, Freud always believed that there were these kind of basic sexual and aggressive instincts that we had that was in the back of our mind and our unconscious, as he coined it. And what he believed kind of came through for personality is that there was kind of this fighting between satisfying these instincts, these animalistic instincts, and satisfying that versus also satisfying, how we now view how we need to behave in society. And so it was kind of balancing that. And from that idea came this idea of the id, the ego, and the superego, which you will need to know for the exam. So Freud's structures of personality are the id, the ego, and the superego. And there's a really cool video that kind of explains it better, which I will include, but to very briefly go over it. The best way to describe it, and I'm actually going to bring myself back, there I am, is the classic image of the angel and the devil on your shoulder. So you have the angel on one side, that's telling you, all the right things that you should do, like, you're on a diet, don't break your diet, you've been doing so good. And then you have the devil on your other shoulder that's saying, like, oh, but you want that cheeseburger, you want to go to McDonald's, you want that sausage, egg, and cheese McMuffin, you want 10 of them. And then there's you in the middle that's listening to both sides, and saying, okay, yeah, I do need to stay on my diet. Oh, but I really do like the sausage, egg, and cheese McMuffins. And, you try to satisfy both sides. That's what we mean by the id, the ego, and the superego. So when we talk about the id is the there we go. The animalistic instinct. So that is in our unconscious. That is, as Freud describes it, that kind of back of the mind thoughts of that sexual and aggressive nature. So we aren't aware of it. It's in our unconscious. But then you have that angel side, so the super ego, and the way I think of it is like Superman. Superman, is all about doing the right thing. And so your super ego is kind of the opposite side, where, how society says we're supposed to act. And then we have the ego, which is you. And ego literally means, like, the self, in, I believe, Latin. That then needs to try to satisfy both the id and the superego. So going back to my example of, you're on a diet, but you like burgers and McDonald's, sausage, egg, and cheese McMuffin, what the ego might finally say is, okay, yes, I'm on a diet. How about this? I'll have a salad today, or like a really healthy breakfast, and, if I can stay on my diet for all of that day, tomorrow I'll have a cheat day where I'll reward myself with a sausage, egg, and cheese McMuffin, but only one. So that way it's satisfying kind of both sides. So that's the theory that Freud had with this whole idea of the id, the ego, and the superego. And again, the easiest way to remember it is that whole idea of the angel and devil on your shoulder. What Freud also came up with is this idea of defense mechanisms. And what you will need to know on the exam is that what defense mechanisms do is it prevents anxiety if troubling thoughts reach our awareness. So again, Freud had this idea that a lot of our thoughts are in our unconscious mind, and, sometimes they make it to the surface, and we don't like that. And so we come up with all these different ways to, make ourselves feel better. The first one is something that everyone has gone through, and that's denial. So you just refuse that it's even happened. Like, no, I didn't do it. Didn't happen. That's denial. It makes you feel better, because you don't want to acknowledge what happens. Next one is repression. So this is when, you make yourself forget. We talked about this before in a previous chapter, but it is a conscious, motivated forgetting of a situation. We then have projection. So this is when you project your own feelings onto someone else. So let's say that, you're feeling really dumb. You feel like you're not as smart as your friends, and so you constantly make fun of your friends whenever they make a mistake. Like, oh, you're so stupid. In fact, you're just projecting how you feel about yourselves on other people. We then have rationalization. So this is when you're just trying to come up with some sort of rational, logical way of explaining something. So some examples is, people that have experienced, what they believe is an alien abduction, and they're trying to explain, how it could happen, or, paranormal activity, like, oh, it must be this, and, there was a change in temperature, I felt really cold, and, so it must be the spirits or taking the energy out of the room, it's trying to come up with some sort of way to, rationalize, and explain a situation. So you feel better, you don't feel like it doesn't make sense. Then we have regression. Regression is when you kind of go back to an earlier stage of your development. So essentially you start acting like a child. This happens with me all the time when I get into an argument with my parents. I revert back to being a child, and I don't act very mature sometimes, so that's regression. Then we have reaction formation, which is when you act in the opposite of how you feel. So a kind of classic example about this is if you go back to like elementary school when there's boys and girls playing on the playground, it's a common conception that people have that if there's a little boy that's constantly pushing a girl or tugging on her hair or stuff like that, people always think, that boy must like that girl and doesn't know what to do with his feelings. That's exactly what Freud would say. That's kind of a reaction formation. The little boy likes the girl, but doesn't want to acknowledge those feelings, so instead he acts in the opposite and is mean towards that girl. And then we have displacement. Displacement is, let's say that you're getting really frustrated at your job. Your boss is just constantly making you do more and more hours and doing more and more things, but, not paying you anymore, and you're getting really frustrated. You don't want to let that frustration out on your boss, because then you're just going to lose your job. So instead what you do is you go home and you let it out on your kids, or you let it out on a pillow or your electronics. You destroy or let your aggression out on something that can't fight back or is less threatening. So that's displacement. And then the last one is sublimation. This is when you take a socially unacceptable sexual or aggressive kind of energy, or something that usually society says is wrong, and you find a socially acceptable way to display it. A classic example of this is, let's say there's someone who really likes to fight. They become a boxer. Usually, beating up people isn't considered a good thing to do. It's not socially acceptable, but when you're doing it as a boxer, it is okay. It is socially acceptable. So it's finding, a socially acceptable, not outlook, way of letting out that feeling or unconscious thought. Maybe outlook was the word I was looking for. But anyway, and here's some other examples again for each of them. Oh boy. There are going to be five questions on the exam that have to do with Freud's psychosexual stages. And essentially what will happen, and this is very similar to the first exam, where there were the different types of research, you're going to get 5 different examples of how a person is behaving, and you need to figure out what stage they're in. So I'm going to relatively quickly go through each stage. And it should be noted that while this is an important part in psychology, these sort of stages are not widely seen as being true. There is not much research to back them up. But it is an important thing to know. So, Freud believed that there were different stages, and kind of similar to Erik Erikson, there was this idea that there was some sort of a kind of conflict or some sort of a crucial thing that was happening in each of these stages that a person had to overcome. And it would affect your personality and who you became later on. So the first one's the oral stage. That happens from birth to the first year of life. And the whole idea was the area of conflict, as it were, was breastfeeding. And if you were weaned too early or too late. And so the, as it was called, androgynous zone, the place where Freud believed that people drew pleasure, was the mouth. Thus, oral, meaning, your mouth. And so the idea was that if you were weaned too early or too late from breastfeeding, you would later on in life develop certain personality defects. So you would have what's known as an oral fixation. Which you might have heard before. So, someone that's constantly biting their nails, or, they have to chew on a pencil or chew on gum, or they'd like to smoke because, they have to have something in their mouth. Freud would say that the reason why these people are like that is because they have an oral fixation, because they were weaned either too early or too late during this period. So that is the oral stage. We then get to the anal stage. This is from years 1 to 3. And the kind of crisis period or crisis event is potty training. And so Freud believed that if you were potty trained either too strictly or not strictly enough, you would either become orally retentive or orally expulsive. And so you'd either be like way too uptight about things or way too loose about things, later on in life, their personality. And it all had to do with your potty training and how that went. Then we get to the phallic stage. This is from ages 3 to about 5 or 6. And this is where Freud believed that little boys and little girls first become aware of, that boys have something that girls don't have, girls, don't have something that boys have, and they become aware of it. And they become aware of kind of feelings around it. So sexual curiosity, as you see. And Freud believed that if you did not successfully get through this stage, the kind of thing of conflict is associating these feelings that you were experiencing for the first time incorrectly. And so what Freud believed is that for little boys, the female figure that they love the most is their mothers, which makes sense. And so at this crucial time, they would then see that, their fathers were the romantic interests of the mother. And if they did not get through this stage correctly, as Freud saw, they would start to see their father as competition. And they would misassociate these feelings that they had towards their mothers and get what is known as an Oedipus complex, or as you see here, it's called the Oedipal conflict. When you start to have more sexual feelings towards your mother and then see your father as competition. If you got through this stage successfully, though, then you would look up to your father and say, okay, this is the kind of person that I should be, and therefore your personality would be very similar to your father, so you can attract someone similar to your mother. So that is the phallic stage. Then we get to the latency stage, from ages 5 or 6 to about puberty. And this is why it's called latency, because you don't really see what's going on, but it's when there was a sexual calm. So these kind of feelings that you were experiencing during the phallic phase go away, and it's more just learning what it means to be a boy or what it means to be a girl, like different societal norms, different interests, hobbies, things like that. And so it was a whole idea that boys hang out with boys, they learn how to be a boy, girls hang out with girls, they learn how to be girls. And that's kind of it for the latency stage. And then the last one is the genital stage. And this is when there is a reemergence of those sexual interests. This happens during puberty. And then it's just this idea of establishing a mature sexual relationship. This is when, according to Freud, any of those personality deficits or personality abnormalities that might have come from all the other stages started to emerge and would cause issues with finding a sexual mate, or to find a relationship, I should say. So those are the different stages. Again, you'll get examples for each one on the exam, and you will need to figure out which one goes where. But it should be said that there's really not much research to back up that these stages are really a thing. And this is just another one that helps to explain, again, the erogenous zone, where the sexual pleasure comes from in each stage, or, where you get pleasure from, the conflict that was happening, and then how it, again, affects your characteristics or personality later on in life, according to Freud. But as I've mentioned, there's a lot of things that Freud came up with that isn't seen as much today or has much credibility today because there isn't much research to back it up. But there are people known as neo-Freudians that take some of the ideas and then add to it and do more research to help support what they've added. And so the first one is Carl Jung. And what you will need to know about Carl Jung is his idea of the collective unconscious is what he added to it. Because there was already this idea of the ego, and there was already this idea of the unconscious, but Carl Jung kind of split off the idea of the unconscious and believed that there was this personal unconscious, so like your own, kind of hidden in the back of your mind, impulses and thoughts and things like that. But then there was also this collective unconscious where it seemed like every single person had the same kind of instinct and animalistic, the instincts in the back of their mind across all societies. And this was the idea of the collective unconscious. And then those things that you see in everyone were known as archetypes. But for the sake of the exam, you'll just need to know that for Carl Jung, the thing that he was known for or contributed was this collective unconscious. Another neo-Freudian was Alfred Adler, and he believed that your personality was to kind of overcome and compensate for feelings of weakness and inferiority. It should be mentioned that compensation is another defense mechanism that Freud came up with. There's many. I didn't cover all of them. But that's another one, and this is one that Alfred Adler kind of focused around. And it was also just striving for, feeling superior or just significant. For the sake of the exam, though, what you also need to know is Alfred Adler has this idea of the creative self. And so this whole idea that there's this goal-seeking behavior in this idea of the creative self. So you are constantly driving these new goals out, to overcome, so, you can feel significant, you can feel of worth. And that was Alfred Adler. And then the last Neo-Freudian that we're going to talk about, there's many, many more. This is just another one, is Karin Horn. And she was looking more at the parent-child relationship. Because going back to Freud, he believed that essentially anything that could mess up your personality went back to your mother. If it was breastfeeding, if it was potty training, all of that, it fell back on the mother, which isn't fair. And so Horney looked into that parent-child relationship more, showing how there can be things like basic anxiety that can develop later on in your personality if, you don't have that nice parent-child relationship. And also hostility and resentment that can happen. So it was looking at, it's not just, whether or not the mother did something or not, but the relationship between the parent and the child affects your personality later on. And so that, and here's just a little overview of the things I just talked about. So Freud's psychoanalytical theories, and then some other theories from other Neo-Freudians. But that is it. For the sake of this video, we will be coming back for modules 11.2 and 11.3 will be the next video.